Hey everyone, in this video we'll be talking about some key AI ML launches from AWS reInvent 2024. And for those of you that are not aware, reInvent is a end of the year conference essentially hosted by AWS in Las Vegas. And many of the key different feature launches are highlighted at this conference, not just across AI ML, but the entire AWS ecosystem. I've luckily had the privilege of being a speaker on the AWS side these last 4 years, so I worked pretty heavily in the AI ML space, and what I wanted to do was, a challenge I've always had is there's so much cool information and knowledge that's shared here, but I wanted to make it a little easier for those of you that are specifically interested in AI ML by highlighting some of these key features and sharing some resources for you to get started with. This isn't a comprehensive list by any means. I'd check out the official AWS channels via blog or YouTube essentially to understand a more kind of complete list in terms of everything that's been launched. But these are more features that stood out for me and I think will especially take an important place in this coming year in the Gen AI space especially. So what I wanted to do was at a high level overview these launches, and I've also shared different resources that you can access. So after this video you can grab these. This Notion page right here is public. I'm going to link it down below for you to access. You can grab all the resources I've linked here essentially, and you can test it out and play with it. And also in coming videos what I'll do is I'll get hands-on with some of these features because we really only get to understand them once we start building with them. So we'll get hands-on and we'll play with them, but in the meantime, feel free to take a look at some of the resources that I've linked. That being said, let's get right into it. The first service I wanted to overview launches in was Amazon Bedrock. And as we know in my intro video, which I'll also link down below, this is the foundation model service of AWS. Essentially, you can access different foundation models via APIs, and there's also a managed generative AI experience across different features such as RAG, agents, guardrails, and more. And specifically, a key launch that happened was a new foundation model family with Amazon as a provider was launched, known as Nova. And with Nova, there were 6 new FMs provided spanning text and vision modalities essentially. So Nova Micro is a text-based modality. Nova Lite and Pro are multimodal with text and vision. And then Nova Premier, which is said to be the best performing of these models, is going to be accessible in 2025. Nova Canvas and Real are on the image and video generation modalities respectively. And what I've also added here is the different context lengths, fine-tuning support, some sample use cases that you might be able to play with. But essentially the idea here is, these are all now accessible via the Bedrock service itself. And just like we worked with the Anthropic Claude in the intro video via the Boto 3 SDK, you can do the exact same with these Nova model families. And what I'll do is I'll really quickly hop over into the console. I'll do this back and forth just so you can see some of these new features. But if you go to Bedrock and you go to Model Access, you should see that there's some new ones available for you to request access to. And you'll see that Nova model family here. And you can essentially play with them the same way we played with Claude in the initial video. And you can see the different kind of API specs for how you can essentially interact with any of these different models. I've also linked just the intro blog to it, and then also importantly the feature support matrix. Keep in mind Bedrock is not just a pure API invoke type service. There's also different features, like I said, such as agents and knowledge bases that come in a managed format. So you can see which of these features are accessible for this Nova model family at the moment of this release. Along with that, just feel free to check out the product page too. There's more sample use cases that you can test and play around with there. But yeah, at a high level, new model family, which is always exciting. Test it for your different use cases when it's multimodal especially, This opens up the door for many interesting use cases, and especially Nova Real being a video generator, you can really think of maybe in the marketing space, if you're in that domain, how can I use this for my benefit? That being said, the second major part of Bedrock I wanted to highlight that stood out to me at least was the enhancements to Bedrock agents. For those of you that are not too familiar with agents, this might be a little more nitty-gritty to understand, but at a high level, an agent is essentially, you can think of as you're giving an LLM access to a set of different APIs, or we call them tools, essentially, where the LLM decides which tool should I use to solve what problems. And a high-level example of this might be, you're asking your LLM questions about weather, and then you're asking it questions about a calculator. Once again, a very dummy example. But what you can do is essentially give it 2 tools. One tool that accesses weather-based data, one tool that has maybe calculator access. And depending on the query that comes in, the LLM will intelligently decide what tool to use and what action to take there essentially. So at a very dummy level, that's what an agent is. And the reason agents are so important is that's really where the Gen AI space is trending towards more and more, because we really want to simulate what a human would almost think like, which is as an input comes in, I know the right tool or right kind of place to look for an answer, right? And that's what we're trying to mimic with agents, and that's why Bedrock Agents is such a crucial feature, because it's a managed kind of agent service, and this was launched earlier in the year, or I think last year. I'd have to double check that. But along with agents, right, there were some enhancements that essentially came in here. First one was a custom orchestrator, and what this essentially means is for your agent, you can define the orchestration or decision-making process. The default is a tactic known as React currently with Bedrock agents, where there's a reasoning and an action that takes place. And this is effective in certain strategies, but if you ever have a custom orchestration strategy, right, where you know that your LLM needs to use maybe two tools or two tools or two APIs in parallel, then you can define a custom orchestrated strategy essentially via an AWS Lambda function and say, this is the chain of thought or this is the course of action that I essentially want you to take. And while this is extra work from a prompt or a code configuration perspective, right, it also gives you more flexibility because you can essentially define the strategy or way of thinking or course of action that your agent should take. And some other methodologies include Rewoo. And in the blog that I've linked here, the Bedrock teams put out a pretty neat way of showing how you can define a custom orchestration for the Rewoo strategy here itself. And along with this, there's many code samples with this feature launch that you could take a look at for what's essentially happening. And this is all accessible once again via the Bedrock UI as well. So if you go to agents, I don't have anything created right here at the moment. You can create an agent and you can associate your orchestration strategy via Lambda function essentially. So a very effective feature if you're getting very nitty gritty with how you want your agent thinking, and especially as these workflows get more and more complex, this will be very handy in that sense. Now, I know I talked about agents in a singular format, but the world's also trending towards a multi-agent kind of route. Because let's say you have I'm trying to think of a use case, a travel planner, or you're having an itinerary planned for a vacation. You might need a booking agent. You might need a restaurant picking agent. You might need a hotel reservation agent. And all those might need access to multiple different APIs or tools that you might need to work with. So what Bedrock did was they launched a multi-agent collaboration feature. And with this multi-agent collaboration feature, essentially, you can have a supervisor agent, which you can think of as the parent agent, and you can delineate collaborator agents, which are essentially the childs that are all within the same agent team working underneath that supervisor. So think of it very similar to a parent and child processing type of workflow. And what Bedrock does is, right, it makes this super simple where you can make a agentic team almost. And for the supervisor agent, you can essentially provide instructions saying this is when to use this agent or that agent, and it will decide a proper course of action or workflow, essentially depending on the purpose you provided for each agent on the team. So this is very, very powerful, and I'd very much explore the blog and code samples here because I really think the world, at least personally, is trending in this direction. Because the more and more we're trying to simulate and automate tasks that would require a human workforce traditionally, that's where multi-agents really take precedent and help you out in that process. And once again, you can define all of this within this agent's UI or via code as well. The next part, right, is Amazon SageMaker specifically. This is the next service that I wanted to talk about in this section right here. And specifically, I wanted to talk about SageMaker Inference. And SageMaker Inference, as we talked about, is the process of deploying and hosting a model and serving it for inference, essentially. And a few key launches were really kind of stood out to me, at least, where you can really enhance your Gen AI workloads and also improve performance, especially when it comes to kind of like highly sensitive latency or throughput sensitive workloads. The first feature was multi-adapter hosting in a managed format. And what multi-adapter hosting is referring to is, for those of you that are familiar with PEFT, there's QLoRa adapters essentially that are created from fine-tuning. And this is once again getting really nitty-gritty, but QLoRa is essentially a fine-tuning tactic where you take a subset of the base model's parameters and fine-tune based off of that. And a adapter model weights are generated from that essentially. So you can think of this as a very cheap and efficient way of fine-tuning a LLM without having to train on the entire set of parameters of the LLM itself. And this tactic, LoRa, has become really, really popular in the past few years with Gen AI imploding. So what SageMaker did here, right, is it provided a managed way of saying, let's say I have multiple different LoRa adapters. I've trained let's say my Llama model for a summarization use case, and then also a sentiment analysis use case. I want to have a way where I can load these adapters essentially on top of my base model. And what SageMaker provides here in this new feature launch via these inference components, which is a deployment option, essentially here is you can have both the base model and the multiple different adapters as almost childs of that base model, all within a singular endpoint. And the loading and unloading of these adapters from GPU, CPU, and disk memory is essentially taken care of for you from the SageMaker service, essentially. So at a high level, the reason this is so important or so effective is when you're especially scaling your LLM, right, to maybe fine-tune across multiple different data sets or use cases, having something like this where you can have multiple adapters on the same endpoint is very cost and performance efficient. Whereas traditionally, you might need persistent hardware for each model that you're trying to deploy. But this makes it very simple to manage and maintain all these adapters on a singular point of contact with that base model. And it also, from a cost angle, is very useful where you don't need a persistent REST endpoint for each and every single one of them. That was multi-adapter hosting. The second feature that stood out for me here as well was scale down to zero. So for those of you that have worked with SageMaker real-time endpoints before, traditionally there used to have to be at least a singular instance behind the endpoint. An instance is the hardware essentially. And this was difficult for maybe users, right, that have idle periods where they don't really need any hardware behind it. And that's where scale down to zero was introduced, this reinvent essentially, where you can essentially bring down the instance count to zero, but understand there's also trade-offs here, right? So if you do bring it down to zero, it's not going to be an instantaneous scale up to one. So if you need instant responses, you want to weigh the trade-offs in terms of what exactly is happening here, because if you scale down to zero, it is going to take some time to essentially launch up the instance count again. But it's a very useful feature, for example, if you know when you're going to be completely idle, when you need to scale back up, and you can define the policies as needed there essentially. Once again, I've attached the blog, documentation, and code sample here. In this code sample, you can essentially understand inference components, which I mentioned earlier, and also just how you can define an auto scaling policy within SageMaker Inference itself specifically. Then there were some additional scaling and performance improvements that came that also stood out to me. First one for this, and this is once again getting really deep into real-time inference for those that are interested. Number one is container caching. If you're familiar with SageMaker Inference, you know that you have to associate a Docker image basically that provides the runtime environment for working with the model essentially. And this used to be a challenge when auto-scaling your endpoint, right? If you're bringing in new instances behind the endpoint when you have more traffic, then you essentially had to re-download this image, right? You had to pull this image from ECR, which is the container registry on Amazon, whenever making a new model copy essentially. And there's a lot of time for this because these images you can think of, they're in the scale of many gigabytes, right? So this would add to the time as you were scaling out, and this takes away, right? Because your requests are essentially getting queued then. Because as you're scaling out to multiple different instances, you're still pulling this image. And to address this, right, what essentially happened here is the service is pre-caching the container image. So you don't really have to deal with this overhead of having this pull from ECR for your Docker image that you might be working with essentially. And that's going to help you a lot specifically during auto-scaling because on every new instance, you don't have to worry about the latency of that operation again. And there's support for this across popular SageMaker deep learning containers, such as like LMI, the large model inference container, text generation inference, Torch Serve, and an NVIDIA Trident inference server. In this blog that I've linked to, you can see the specific versions of the different containers that are supported essentially. But yeah, a very crucial feature, especially when it comes to scaling to help with performance. The second one is a challenge across any LLM hosting essentially. So when you're dealing with the fast model loader, which is what the name of this feature launch is, what it's adhering to essentially is saying that loading LLMs is a difficult task. We're looking at LLMs greater than 50 GB, and it's super computationally expensive to download this. And the time to download it too is very heavy. And similar to container caching, right? When we're launching new instances and you need to load your model into that new instance, you don't want to deal with that overhead because there's still going to be requests coming in. And if we don't have this model ready for you, that's essentially going to be very difficult. So this fast model loader, which was launched, helps in two different types of ways. With ahead of time compilation, essentially, you can pre-shard the model. So you're already splitting the model into different chunks rather than having the whole model by itself. This is a technique known as tensor parallel. And you have these chunks existing. And what is also happening is you're directly streaming these model weights from S3, which is the model data source, into the GPU itself. And this is once again saving you a lot of startup time when launching a new instance. So ahead of time is a key word to keep in mind here with the sharding essentially, and then also directly streaming these weights in. And this is all accessible once again via code where you can enable this. And we also have all this accessible by the higher level model builder class in SageMaker itself. So this is two key features, especially when it comes to dealing with stringent throughput and latency requirements that you'll want to enable within your code itself, because this will give you a significant kind of performance gains essentially when you're auto-scaling your endpoint itself. So those 4 features were specifically within SageMaker Inference, just to keep an eye out for. And then the last one I wanted to overview was actually something on the UI basis, and I'll hop into this in a second, but it was launched in preview known as SageMaker Unified Studio. A general challenge a lot of people have in the ML development lifecycle or any data analytics project is there's many different kind of services that are accessible on AWS, but there's no single domain or UI interface where you can essentially work with all these different services. So Unified Studio kind of bridges that solution, where it gives you access to all these different services, analytics, data lakes, Gen AI app development by Bedrock. Amazon SageMaker, the original service, got renamed to SageMaker AI, I believe. But this new Amazon SageMaker platform, essentially, right, you have access to this UI, a singular domain or working environment, right, where you can essentially work with all these different services and have your teams kind of onboarded there. And if we go into the UI, right, this is just to avoid confusion for you, we'll see that there's 2 SageMakers that are now available. SageMaker AI is the traditional SageMaker that we've always worked in prior to this. And this is where you can see your notebooks, your studio environment, inference training, and things of that sort. And then SageMaker Platform, right, is where you essentially have this central IDE where you can work with all these different services. So I haven't created a domain here, I believe, or yeah, I actually do have one. If we open this right here, and while that's opening, we can also see on the side the different kind of services and features that are accessible. But if we open this domain, basically, you'll see that there's essentially playgrounds or an environment where you can essentially interact with all the different kind of components that we were talking about. So for Gen AI app dev, you can use Bedrock, for instance. For ML and model dev, you can use SageMaker. So all of these are accessible for you in a single unified interface. And the reason this is so valuable is, right, a realistic data engineering or ML engineering project is not just one service. You're probably going to be working with many of these different features. So this gives you a singular platform to be able to work with it, essentially. And I think that brings a wrap to at least the features that really stood out for me. Like I said, this is all a public Notion page, and I'll link it down below. And all these different blogs and code samples will go in deeper. I know we walked through this at a much higher level in terms of what exactly we were covering, but what we'll do in future videos, right, is especially with these launches, we'll build code samples for you to get familiar with and for you to understand specifically. And any questions that you have, feel free to leave in the comments and we can overview them and check out the official kind of AWS blogs and kind of documentation here for any information that I might have missed that might be a little lower level that you're interested in. But yep, I think that's a wrap for today. It would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe, and I will be back soon and we'll be coming back with more content around all this. Thank you as always for watching.